Okay, wonderful. Good to see you all again tonight. So we are on, this is our third class in Wheel of Sharp Weapons. Last week we made it up through verse 6. Let me just put on the outline here one more time. Whoops, what am I doing? Got to click on the share screen first. That would help. By the way, I did want to mention this was the meditation that got sent out with Sarah's um, email this week on cherishing others. And it's actually based on one of the meditations it's done in Shantideva's 8th chapter, where you kind of put on one side a selfish version of yourself, the other side, all these kind of a group of people who are all suffering, and, kind of see who are you more attracted to? Who do you think is actually, has greater integrity? The people who are suffering, or the person who's just selfish and only concerned about their own welfare. So again, that's well worth investigating that meditation. I will have some additional meditations that I will distribute for this week, too, that you can work with throughout the course, or at least for this initial part of the course. So again, we are in this section at the beginning. We're almost done with it. Bodhisattvas transform afflictions and self-grasping into the path. This is the first of the outlines within conventional bodhicitta. Recall that we do have a latter part of the text where we go into ultimate bodhicitta, and that will start at verse 103 and take us almost to the end, just before the dedication verse. But this section on conventional bodhicitta, by conventional bodhicitta, again, we mean the mind aspiring to become a Buddha for the sake of others. This is what we're working on in particular in this text, is within the technique of equalizing and exchanging self and others, kind of replacing our self-cherishing mode with the mode that cherishes others, that type of mindset. So we're going to have one more verse, again, verse 7, where we talk about this idea of transforming afflictions and self-grasping into the path, that the bodhisattvas are like these peacocks that partake of the poison in order to make their feathers even more lustrous, unlike the crows, the um, sort of weak crows that don't have any courage, that are, cowardly and so on, that they partake of the poison and they die. But the bodhisattvas go to these places of suffering and difficulty and work with them to enhance their qualities. And then we're going to have verse 8 coming up tonight, where we look at this idea of Tonglen, practicing removing others' suffering and giving them happiness, and then go on to a huge section that's from verse 9 through 48, where we talk about these different causes, karmic cause and effect, and their antidotes. Okay, so let's go to these slides and get back grounded in those as well. So let's see. Whoops, that was pretty much what I covered. Remember that on that outline, actually, this is, I'm sorry, I forgot when we went through that outline that I made that correction last week. So we're actually going through verse 8 is be the first outline, and then 9 will be the verse on Tonglen. And then it's verses 10 through 48. So this is where we're at. We're in this first section, verses 1 through 8. So now it says, presently, for those circling without freedom, self-grasping is Mara's messenger. While parting from the happinesses of selfishness and hedonism, and then it goes on, but we're only going to look at the first 3 lines. This is how Geshe Jampa Gyatso in his commentary looks at this, is this idea of we are presently, circling without any freedom. This is the state that we find ourselves in and that all beings are in. Self-grasping is the messenger of the Mara. The Mara here, the main Mara is usually a term used just to refer to a demon. And most of the Maras are demons within ourselves. They're not external demons and external forces of harm. We have plenty within ourselves. We don't need even those external ones. But the idea here is that self-grasping and self-cherishing, as I said, these twin demons, they do play different roles at different times. And here the idea is that self-grasping comes first as the messenger, kind of heralding the arrival of self-cherishing. But nonetheless, again, we see that sometimes the relationship is reversed. And the idea is that we want to part from these happinesses that arise from our selfishness, from our self-cherishing, our hedonism. So let's look at what Geshe Jampa Gyatso says in his commentary on this. I'll pull that up right now. Go into that passage it's on. Let me see, what page number is this? Page 4 of your text. It says presently, again, I don't need to read the verse. It says the main thing that makes all sentient beings, exemplified by the hearers, solitary realizers, and so forth. Of course, hearers and solitary realizers, I think I've mentioned them previously in this course, but certainly you've heard of them before. They are the practitioners of the path that leads to individual liberation, what sometimes now is being called like the fundamental vehicle or fundamental path. Those beings are not as courageous as the bodhisattvas. They don't have the ability to take on the welfare of all sentient beings in the way that bodhisattvas do. So it says the main thing that makes all of those beings engage in circling in the abodes of psychic existence without working toward Buddhahood is self-cherishing. So he kind of is essentially delineating that there is a subtle form of self-cherishing, again, that keeps those beings from dedicating themselves to the welfare of others. Even though hearers and solitary realizers do attain great realizations, they are able to remove all of their afflictions, but they don't do it within the context of being dedicated to serving other sentient beings. We talked about this in the first class, how His Holiness said that this very subtle form of self-cherishing indicates that, again, we can't really say that all of self-cherishing is afflicted, because it's not necessarily in those being, or not necessarily only in beings that have afflictions. The hearers and solitary realizers that complete their path actually can have this subtle form of self-cherishing that keeps one just focused on one's own welfare. So in that way, we wouldn't say this is an afflicted state, but it's a problem for the bodhisattvas, right? Because the bodhisattvas don't want to be bound by that mind. They want to actually be dedicated to the welfare of others. That's why in Geshe-la's commentary, he says, therefore, we must act against it. Thus, there is a difference between the two, self-grasping and self-cherishing, because again, self-cherishing is that main obstacle of a bodhisattva to overcome, to develop bodhicitta, whereas self-grasping is overcome by even those on the hearer path, the solitary realizer path, and so on. So it says, whereas self-cherishing itself is a Mara, a demon, its messenger is self-grasping. These two exist in the manner of master and servant. Now, again, it's hard to always put language on this, and even in the commentary that Geshe Jampa Gyatso gave on his own brief text here, his way of approaching it was a little hard for me to kind of fully get in terms of why it's being referred to in this way. But I'm going to share a little bit about that from another text as well, from Geshe Sopa, and what he says about the relationship between these two in this line in particular. Again, in other parts of the text, you're going to see kind of almost like a reverse relationship. But recall that these are the twin demons. They look somewhat alike, and they are arising oftentimes together in our minds. So it's very hard to differentiate them out sometimes. And it says, through parting from both the master, self-cherishing, and his servant, self-grasping, as well as the happiness of selfishness, the happiness of hedonism, and so forth, we should not come under the influence of the desires of these two. In other words, we should see them for what they are. They are not acting in our best interest, and therefore, we should do whatever we can to overcome them, which is, of course, what the rest of the text is going to be about, overcoming self-cherishing primarily through the teachings we're going to look at initially on karma and then overcoming self-grasping later. So Geshe Sopa says, right now, living beings in psychic existence circle uncontrollably from life to life. They have no way out of this cycle. The root cause of this, the messenger of the devil or of evil, is the view of a real personal identity. That's the self-grasping, right? We always say that's the root cause of being in samsara. Self-cherishing isn't the main cause, it's self-grasping, the ignorance that adheres to this strong view of a self. And that's the mechanism by which we get into trouble, having attachment towards what is pleasurable, aversion towards what is unpleasant, and so on. This is the main mechanism, is that mind that is clinging to this strong sense of an I. As it says there, grasping at a real, unique, permanent I or me. The self-cherishing attitude is like a devil or evil force, and the driving force is usually selfishness, wishing to have only pleasure and enjoyment, and we can say, and only for ourselves or for those we're very close to. Self-cherishing does think of others sometimes, but only others who take care of us, who are involved in kind of our well-being that we're quite attached to. So he says, once we realize that these desires and attitudes, self-grasping and self-cherishing, and our attachment to them are to blame for our continued misery and cyclic existence, we should cast away these mental states. So again, he doesn't go into great detail about why one is self-cherishing is being called the devil or the demon, and why self-grasping is the messenger. Um, Again, when we think of a messenger again heralds the arrival of that other mind and comes before it. And so in many ways we can say, again, even though there isn't this causal relationship that, His Holiness said there wasn't that causal relationship between these two, oftentimes it is through our self-grasping that our self-cherishing arises, because again, these two do work in tandem in minds like our own that haven't yet calmed these different attitudes. Okay. So now we go on to verse 7d, the final line of this. Let me go back to the text. This is kind of toggling back and forth. That's what I will be doing throughout this whole course, I guess. We should willingly accept hardships for the welfare of others. So Geshe Jampa Gyatso says we should we should turn away from selfishness and so forth. That is, we should willingly undertake others' welfare in general, as well as the welfare of others that is particularly difficult to undertake. So again, with the attitude that is focused on the welfare of others, that is about embracing, taking care of them, helping them, not having them suffer, we will then accept whatever hardships. We won't retaliate. We won't get angry and upset at them. We won't harm them when we are harmed. This is kind of setting the tone for what's going to come in the verses from 10 through 48 when we look at what happens when we experience various types of karma, either through others happening, doing something that happens to us, or through things that are just happening in our environment or what have you. So let's go back briefly to the slides, and we'll just take a look at what's there. Again, I don't think I have too much there, just a little bit of a follow-up from what Geshe Sopa was saying. He says, we should willingly and joyfully undertake whatever hardship is necessary for the benefit of others. If you strongly develop such an attitude, no difficulty will cause you to feel anger or impatience toward others. Again, this is the goal, is that we want to be in a mind that is only generating thoughts of cherishing others, of holding them dear, so that when things do come into our lives, problems, difficulties, annoyances, people who are doing things that upset us or harm us or what have you, we don't retaliate. We don't develop this impatience and anger. Instead, we maintain a view that will help us to make good use of it, to recognize that this is just like the peacocks taking the poison and making it into something that will beautify their feathers. So again, it's the same sort of message that we're getting, just from slightly different angles in these first few verses. This is verse 8. I'll read it from here, and then we will go to Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary. It says, the sufferings of all beings who are similar in kind, in being driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions, should be heaped upon us hedonists. So this is already starting to sound like, again, the verse on Tong Len. As I mentioned, that outline does have verse 8, but that was in a slightly different enumeration of the verses that occurs in Thupten Jinpa's presentation. I think he takes like verses 3 and 4 or something and combines them. And so you end up with his verse 8 is our verse 9, because we have separate verses for those. So anyway, but the idea here is that we're already having this thought being generated of like whatever is, happening to others, all of their sufferings, who are similar in kind to ourselves, in that they're driven by their actions, their karma, they're habituated to these deluded states of mind, these two being the cause of their suffering, the karma and delusions. All of that we should think should be heaped upon us. Let it rain down on us rather than ripen for those sentient beings. This is the mindset that leads us into the practice of Tonglen, that makes us willing to take on the suffering of others. Even if we cannot physically do that at this time, we at least want to generate the courageous mind that looks at that issue that way. So again, this is the commentary Geshe-la does on verse 8. We who wander without freedom in the abodes of cyclic existence and experience only suffering are driven by the bad actions we have accumulated under the power of self-cherishing, and habitually rely on the afflictions by the force of having done this many times. So just, these are why we often say that we are under the control of our karma and delusions, or under the power of self-cherishing, as it says here, is because essentially these have become so deeply ingrained in us that it's very hard to break free of them. We see in our own practice, right? Many of us having practiced for decades, and how difficult it is to get rid of that mind that is driving it, the self-cherishing, as well as the deeper mind of self-grasping that is the root for all of the afflictions. Now, this is the state that beings are all in, just like ourselves, under the control of these factors. At least we know we're under the control of these factors, whereas a lot of beings don't even recognize them as part of why they suffer. So then the conclusion that we come to from that is saying, because of this, from now on, we should heap upon ourselves, we who desire our own happiness and pleasure, all the sufferings without exception of all the beings who are similar in kind to us in being driven by actions and habituated to the afflictions. So when we see that other sentient beings are just like us, then we should recognize that our own desire to be happy and to not suffer is the same for all of those beings. And again, if we want to reverse our own patterns of suffering, which are driven by self-cherishing, we should be taking on the suffering of others, cherishing them, wanting them to be happy and so on. So here I think I do have a few additional slides to share in regard to that verse once more from Geshe Sopo, which I'm really finding, I do love Venerable Tipton Chodron's commentary. It's a bit more contemporary and more Western, and I will share passages from it at times, but Geshe Sopa's I think is really quite a nice commentary to complement Geshe Jampa Gyatso's brief commentary. So it says, all beings in psychic existence are pursued by the results of their own actions and habituation to the afflictions of attachment and hatred and so on. This is what causes their sufferings. Right? We should know this again from previous teachings we've had on the Four Noble Truths, that this is why sentient beings suffer. The second truth, the origin of their suffering, their dukkha, their dissatisfaction, is their karma and delusions. And this is why they are in that state. Seeing yourself as someone who seeks only pleasure, recognizing that this is how we are, we thank you, I'll take the pleasure over the suffering any day. You should pray to have all the miseries and sufferings of others heaped upon yourself. You should reverse that thinking. Remember how I said, I think in the first class, that Lama Zopa Rinpoche in his book, Transforming Problems into Happiness, says that eventually we should get to a place where we like suffering the same way that we like ice cream or music. We should be willingly and even happily wanting the sufferings of others to ripen on ourselves, to heap these upon ourselves, which again is the mindset that we develop in the practice of Tonglen that's coming up in the next verse. So he says, we should think this way in order to make war against the enemies of ego clinging and self-cherishing, especially self-cherishing. Because again, recall that that is the Mara, the main, force that is being combated against here, especially in this first part of the text. But, when we have that conscious willingness to take on the suffering of others, it's the exact opposite of what our self-cherishing mind wants, right? Thank you very much. I'll stay at home, kick up my feet, watch some Netflix, take care of myself, da 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 da. I don't really want to be, challenged with all these things and have to cherish others and hold them more dear and sacrifice my own kind of happiness in the moment. Now, recall again that you're not sacrificing anything in the long term, because your happiness is assured when you dedicate your life to other beings. But in the short term, it is challenging, without a doubt. Okay, so now we go on to verse 9. So again, recall that I've got a sort of separate, section for that, because this is the verse. It's verse 8 on the outline, the colored outline that you have, but that's, again, according to Thupten Jinpa's translation, it's verse 9 in our text. This is the verse that actually spells out the practice of removing other suffering and giving them happiness. It is the practice of Tonglen. Tong is the Tibetan word for give. Len is the Tibetan word for take. It's practiced in a reverse order, usually taking away the suffering of others, giving them our happiness. But nonetheless, it's that compassionate wish that others not suffer, and the wish of loving kindness towards others, that wants them to have happiness, that's willing to even give our happiness to others. Okay, so this is the first part of that verse, which is the giving. Suppose we were to dwell entangled in selfishness. At that time, to counteract it, we should give our happiness and pleasure to migrating beings. This is the way to combat our selfishness. And even when we are experiencing something that is delicious and delightful, that we don't have anyone there that we could necessarily offer it to, we can mentally offer it to others. Whatever pleasure and happiness we have, always be sending it out to other beings to experience. Let them have that happiness, that pleasure. Again, it doesn't mean that you don't end up with that pleasure or happiness at all. In fact, as we just saw, that will actually create the causes for your future happiness without a doubt. And while you're eating that food, of course, you can experience the pleasure, the happiness of it, but keep giving it away. Make it, more and more expansive rather than the mind of selfishness that contracts around it. Then the second part of the verse, likewise, when those around us mistreat us, or when we have any type of suffering arising, we should be filled with contentment, thinking, this is retribution for having distracted them. This is, our own karma ripening. And of course, this is where we're headed to in the verses 10 through 48, is that if we have the understanding that whenever we're experiencing suffering, it is a product of our own past actions. Therefore, everything that we experience that is in that nature of what we call suffering is our own karmic retribution. It's just things coming back around, like that wheel of sharp weapons that is in the title, and that we're going to be seeing, repeated again and again throughout the refrain of this verse, these verses that are coming up in verses 10 through 48. So let's go to Geshe-la's commentary on this verse. He divides it into two parts. The first part about giving, he says, supposing, that is hypothetically, that even though it is in fact impossible for most bodhisattvas to ever dwell entangled in selfishness. Of course, when we read it, we take it as, well, yeah, I'm there, I'm entangled in selfishness. But he's saying, for those bodhisattvas, those brave beings, those peacock-like beings, even though it's impossible for most of them to ever dwell entangled in selfishness, if, or supposing that by the force of previous habituation, it were possible for this to happen to some of them, at that time they should counteract it through reproaching themselves, saying, you are hopeless, kind of that sense of self-shame that we kind of put through, self-respect. We kind of use that as a tool to get us to think differently. Anytime the mind goes to self-cherishing, we want to say, oh, you're hopeless. You just keep following that state of mind. Move in the direction of, cherishing others. So then it says, then they should give away however many excellent things they have, such as their happiness, their pleasure, and so forth, to migrating sentient beings. Likewise, again, I'm just going to read it again. This was again the second part of verse 9. Likewise, when those around us mistreat us, we should be filled with contentment, thinking this is retribution for having distracted them. Likewise, when no matter how much we have benefited those around us, from the least of our servants up to our students, they inflict harm upon us in return. That is, they mistreat us by repaying our kindness with unpleasant talk, deprecation, and so forth, without thinking it is anything else. Think that it is retribution for our having distracted them, that is, for our self-cherishing. In the ways that we've distracted them, harmed them, done things to them, that's the reason why we are now experiencing that back on ourselves. Of course, this framing of this is not to say that this is the only example of this, but this is very similar to the one verse from the 8 verses of thought training, Mahayana thought transformation, which is the verse that is number 6, when those whom I have benefited and in whom I have great hopes gives me terrible harm, I shall regard that person as my most holy guru. So when we have beings who we've benefited in particular, that's the most challenging time often to practice mind training, because we feel that they owe us their allegiance. They owe us to be kind to us and to not harm us and mistreat us. So when they do it, that's a particularly difficult time to practice. But again, just recognize that this is just pointing us in the direction of the practice of taking away the suffering of others, taking on whatever it is that we're experiencing gladly, willingly, so that we see it as a cause for helping us to overcome our self-cherishing. Then he goes on to say, accordingly, let me push this up a little bit so it's towards the center of the screen. Accordingly, since this is retribution for having previously cherished ourselves and inflicted harm on others, we should be filled with contentment for ourselves and say to ourselves, now you yourself are being benefited. Again, this is about that thought transformation. We're going to take the thought that normally sees others harming us or suffering coming into our lives as something that we are happy to push out of our lives, that we don't see any benefit to at all. And we're going to say, oh, let's put out the welcome mat. Please come on in, and I can use you on my path. You're of great benefit to me. If everything that arises in our life that is suffering we see as an opportunity to actually deepen our qualities, to make our feathers more lustrous like the peacock's, then we transmute that poison that normal beings would suffer from into something that actually makes us happy, content, that we actually see great benefit from. So this is the logic of Tonglen that is really the essence of so much of this first part of the text. And that's why, again, I'm going to encourage you to do Tonglen meditation throughout that part of the text, at least, up through verse 48, where we go into all these various things that are happening to us. We need to work with that transformation, that transmuting, that sort of negative energy of something that is difficult for us normally and difficult for most beings into something we actually, welcome. We're willing to work with it, willing to take it on, willing to transform it into the path to enlightenment. So I do have a few slides to share in regard to this. Actually, from Venerable Thupten Chodron's book, she talks about Tonglen, this taking and giving meditation, where we take on the suffering of others and we give them our happiness. And she says people sometimes have objections regarding this. One objection is that it does not work. So some people may think, well, why am I doing this? It doesn't really work. I can meditate all I want on taking away the experience of dealing with coronavirus, for example, that so many people in this country right now are still hospitalized with this. I can think I want to take away their, respiratory problems, everything they're experiencing, and I will gladly experience that for their benefit. Well, it doesn't work, right? Just that thought isn't going to cause you to be in their position and them to be free from it. And then secondly, the other is that it actually might work. We do have that fear that this touches on when our willingness isn't quite there, because we have a fear that this type of mindset is actually going to ripen into our future suffering. And because we dislike suffering so much, that's so deeply ingrained in us, that we don't have that willingness at that time, because we think, I don't think I could bear that. If I were to take on someone's, suffering in the hospital right now with coronavirus, do I really want to do that? If that was the actual result of doing Tonglen. So she addresses these. The first one, she says, we think, I'm only imagining relieving sentient beings of their misery and giving them happiness. That doesn't change their situation at all. So what use is it? Of course, the whole point of this is that we're not trying to change their situation in the moment. We're trying to change our minds so that we can be better capable to help them in the future. So again, whether it's working or not isn't the measure of whether it's successful. It's whether it is causing that inner transformation, whether it's actually addressing the mind of self-cherishing that is the target of Tonglen. Regarding the second, we worry, well, what happens if by visualizing taking on other sufferings, I succeed? I might get sick by imagining taking on others' illness. I might lose my body, my wealth, my merit, because I'm imagining giving them away. So when we do the giving part of it and give all of that to others, well, then maybe that creates the cause for us to lose all that we have. You might actually have these thoughts that Tonglen could actually work. And I know some people who do have a resistance to practicing Tonglen because they do have that fear. But I like what Pema Chodron says in her book, No Time to Lose, which is a commentary on the Shantideva's text. She says someone asked a Tibetan Lama if he was afraid that by breathing in others' suffering during Tonglen meditation practice, he would catch it. Like if he's breathing in the coronavirus, well, then he's going to end up with the virus. To this, he replied that nothing would make him happier than to take on their pain so they could be free of it. When someone can say this, a profound shift has taken place. that's again what we're talking about here, is transmuting that resistance that we normally have to suffering, and of course even the resistance we have to giving things away, to sharing, our merit, our, resources, our body with others, everything, giving it all away happily. There's great resistance there, but we should be doing the exact opposite thing if we're genuinely on the Mahayana path, right? We should be jumping up and down for joy when suffering comes into our life. Oh, good. I get to work with this wonderful thing that's on my plate now. And if we give away our, what we have to others, once more, we should be taking great delight in that. How wonderful that I can fulfill what other people need by giving my money to them, by giving my time to them, my energy to them, whatever it is, giving away my merits to them. This is what the bodhisattva lives for, is to hear the words, please give, or please help me, I'm suffering, or whatever the case is. And we've got a ways to go, admittedly, every one of us, I'm sure. I'm speaking mostly for myself, but it's okay. That's how we train, is gradually moving in this direction. But the Tonglen practice is the most powerful way to do that, to get us to reverse those habitual tendencies to not want to go to the place of taking on suffering, to not want to go to the place of giving away our happiness. So again, I don't need to explain the Tonglen practice in great detail, but Geshe-la will do it in his commentary, coming up with verse 10, which is the first of these verses that set out various situations that we can work with, that we can transmute using the practice of Tonglen. And there is a meditation again that I'm going to send along, two of them actually. One is Tonglen for oneself. They often advise in the traditional Lamrim or Lojong teachings, Geshe Chikawa's 7-point mind training. One of the points is begin the practice of taking and giving with yourself. And so how you do this is you take an objective look at yourself. You visualize yourself and whatever's going on, and you think about yourself as a suffering sentient being, as a being who wants happiness, and you train yourself in practicing Tonglen with yourself. And it sounds kind of strange. It's not meant to, create some sort of, schizophrenia or anything. It's creating the objective view of yourself as a suffering sentient being, and a being who, desires to have happiness and well-being. On the basis of that, and working within that context, then you can apply Tonglen for others. And I know that we have a tendency just to jump right to Tonglen for others. And that's because I think perhaps we, find something really juicy about all that. And we don't necessarily feel that looking at ourselves is that juicy. But if you don't start with yourself, they often say that it's very hard to develop those sorts of mindsets for others fully. So do spend some time with that meditation. Again, I'll have both of them there, the other one, Tonglen for others. And the idea is that we'll be doing this type of meditation throughout these verses in particular that are coming up, because they really do help us, this practice of Tonglen, the two branches of taking away suffering, giving our happiness, to counteract that self-cherishing mind. So let's see, let me go to Geshe-la's commentary on verse 9. I already did those. Actually, yeah, I may have a little bit more, sorry. That went too far. Let me see if I have more slides. I don't remember. I just added some slides earlier today too when I was going through, and I thought, oh, maybe there'd be a couple more things. No, I don't. Okay, so we're going to get into verses 10 through 48. And let me do the introduction to this, and we'll talk a little bit more about karma after the break, but I do want to, at least get started on these verses. Again, recall that on your original outline, the one that you received at the beginning of the course, that one-page outline, that it actually said that this was verses 9 through 48. That's because once more of Geshe, I'm sorry, not Geshe, he is a Geshe, but Thupten Jinpa, he doesn't usually go by the title of Geshe Thupten Jinpa, but his translation has the verse numbers a little different. But this is a whole section that's all about, as it says there, karmic cause and effect and their antidotes. Now you might think, well, what does karmic cause and effect have to do with all this? And we're going to see that, because essentially what is going on in this whole idea of the wheel of sharp weapons, particularly in this section, is that we're working with everything that we have to acknowledge through our understanding of karma is a product of our own past actions. This is a way that we initially frame it so that we don't have any of that mind that gets angry and upset and harms others, because we see that we've created that. It's our own stuff. We threw the wheel of sharp weapons out to harm another, but it's like a boomerang and it comes back and hits us. So every one of these verses through verse 45, the last three have a slightly different flavor to them, 46, 47, and 48. But up through verse 45, they all have a similar pattern. It becomes a bit repetitive even, which is the power of this text to kind of keep using a similar refrain. The very first line of the 4 lines shows you a specific result, something that is happening, in the moment that you need to kind of confront. It's suffering, Okay, this is the suffering that's happening. Line B is the whole idea of, hey, it's your karma, dude. This is your stuff. This is your results. You created it. And then it looks at line C at what was the specific cause of that, as best as can be delineated within this understanding of cause and effect. Dharma Rakshita, the author of this text, said, these are the things that you did that are causing you to have that result. And then line D is the specific remedy, the way that we transmute that current result with the understanding of its cause into something that benefits us and therefore causes us to progress on the path to enlightenment and causes us to be able to benefit others. So this is the schema for these. Let's take a little bit closer look at each of these 4 things. Again, line A is going to be a specific result, which is an unfortunate circumstance we experience, which we would normally label as suffering. Again, over time, we might be able to see it as something beneficial, as was pointed out in that earlier verse, but for now, it's something that is ripening into a suffering experience. Our usual response, or reaction, we might say, I sometimes like to use the word reaction for our habits of afflictions, is to have an affliction. And oftentimes it is anger. Oftentimes it's that mind that cannot stand what is happening to us, that we're not a happy camper at that point, and so we kind of get angry and upset at whoever is closest to us, or even certainly the people who are causing the problems or difficulties for us. So this is our habitual response or reaction. And this is like the poison that we want to transmute. This is what is coming into our experience that is normally poison, like the crows, the cowardly crows. If we were to eat it without this mind training, we would just suffer more and create more causes for suffering. But this is, again, you're going to see this as we go through these, what's happening in that first line is kind of to show you, okay, this is happening. How do we deal with that? Well, the first way we deal with it is to develop this understanding that it's your karma. It's not a random event, but caused by your past actions. It increases confidence by thinking in this way in the karma, in the law of cause and effect. And of course, it eliminates, not just reduces, but eventually eliminates the whole factor of blame. We are a blaming culture, right? As soon as somebody does something that harms someone else, we put all the blame on them. They're at fault. They're the ones that did it. Well, karma doesn't allow you to do that. It's not to say that the other person isn't involved in creating that suffering in your life. But why are they creating that suffering for you? Because you created the karma. They are kind of impelled to harm you by virtue of your own past actions that was the setup for that situation occurring. So this is, again, if we think this way, that we actually created this, we'll have greater faith in karma. And of course, karma is a very important teaching throughout the entire path to enlightenment. So the last comment there, this line where it's saying, this is your karma, this is you taking responsibility for transmuting the suffering, saying, okay, this is my stuff. Well, then I need to work with it. I can't put the blame on anyone else. I can't just make it about, what they're doing. It's what I did that causes this to happen, which of course is coming from my self-cherishing, coming from my self-grasping. So therefore, I need to combat those states of mind in some positive way. So that's the whole idea behind the second line of each of these verses. Um, I threw in here a little bit from Geshe Sopa. This actually comes from his commentary on a later verse, but I think it's very applicable here. He says it says in the Guru worship. That's not the usual translation of that text. It's usually called the Guru Puja, Lama Chopa. We do it, try to do it at least once a month on the date that you're supposed to do it in the lunar calendar. There are two each month where you should do it, but we do a different ceremony that's a bit shorter. It's a bit long, but it's a wonderful text, and it has some Lam Rim verses at the end that go through, in one part, all of these techniques of mind training. And Geshe Sopa is saying here, it says there, when the animate and inanimate worlds are filled with negative results, I think I missed a word in there, all sorts of undesirable things descend on us like rainfall. This is the actual verse he was referring to. I don't know if you can see it all with, I can't see it all with the screen that's on the little header on mine. Even if the environment and beings are filled with the fruits of negativity and unwished for sufferings pour down like rain, I seek your blessings to take these miserable conditions as a path by seeing them as causes to exhaust the results of my negative karma. That's kind of the initial thought that we're having here in this second line is this is my karma and this is ripening for me now. And of course, we don't just want to stop there and think, oh, well, then now that karma's done, wash my hands, move on to the next thing. We actually want to learn from it. And that's where we go in terms of the next two lines is to really think, well, then what is the lesson that I can take away from this? Pema Chodron, in one of her teachings, I'm paraphrasing her a little bit, but she essentially says that karma is life giving us the lessons we need to learn. Whatever comes into your life, be it good, bad, or indifferent, it's teaching you something, and you have to see what that is and use that as a lesson. And of course, the hardest things to learn the lessons from are the sufferings, the difficulties. But if we can begin to see these as, oh, this is a path, this is an opportunity to see that I'm exhausting that negative karma, and I can actually do something different. I can respond with a much more positive state of mind so I don't keep stepping in it, so I don't keep creating the causes to have that experience again. So when such things happen to us, Geshe Sopa says, it is necessary that we have an understanding of why they are happening and where they are coming from. So that kind of leads us with the understanding that it's our karma into part C, where we're going to look at the individual karmas. Before we go on to that, though, I did want to review briefly, and I know that I could spend like the entire evening on this, very briefly, the four general characteristics of karma, as well as the four results of karma. These we went through in the last class when I was talking about the middle scope, or I'm sorry, the small scope. The small scope of the Lam Rim, the very first level of the Lam Rim is where karma is introduced because it's such a key principle initially in helping us to have the results we seek in terms of a good rebirth. But obviously, like I said, karma plays a role throughout our path. All the way to enlightenment. So karma is definite. That means that if you produce an unwholesome seed or action, it will produce in turn a suffering result. If you create a wholesome positive action, it will produce the result of happiness. It's definite. It doesn't get crossed. Happiness doesn't arise from negative actions. Suffering doesn't arise from positive actions. Karma increases. Remember that that's the idea that karma, once we plant that seed, it grows. It's not static. It's not like, okay, I said, something really harsh to somebody in one lifetime, and then 5 lifetimes down the road, somebody says something harsh to me, and that's the only result from it. No, it increases. So over the course of 5 lifetimes, it could increase into unbelievable results. And that goes for positive karma and negative karma. The third is that we can't experience the results without their causes being made. So the corollary, I guess, to this is that if you're experiencing the results, guess what? You must have created those causes. That's a bit of what we're seeing in this text, right? If this is what's happening to you, take ownership of it. Say this was stuff I created, because you can't experience those results without their causes having been there. And then the fourth one is, once you have created the causes, though, actions that are done are never wasted. The results will be experienced eventually, unless interrupted. I always throw in that parenthetical information because it is important that we know that we can interrupt our negative karmas through a process of purification. And we can also interrupt our positive karmas if we don't take care to guard our minds from really powerful states of anger and so on. So this is the four things that guide the rules. This is like the rule book for how karma works. It being definite, increasing, can't experience the results without the causes. Once you do create the causes, though, you will experience the results unless something interrupts that. Then the results of karma. Recall that there are, we normally call four results of karma. There's three categories. The first one is often referred to as, fruitional or ripened results. That's a whole rebirth. Some karmas have the power to propel you into another life. At the end of each life, one karma comes forward to take you into your next life. And that's the projecting karma that will actually result in your future rebirth. So one of the results we have from some karma is an actual rebirth. You had a positive action you created that ripened into your human rebirth. The next two are both called results similar to the cause because there's a flavor in the result that is similar to what you did in terms of the action. The first one is in terms of your experience. Well, that means you have a tendency to do the same thing again and again. Our minds are very malleable. If we keep doing something, we create the same type of karma to do it again. So if we've gotten very habituated to killing, then we will have a result that we will be more prone to kill. I'm sorry, that's the behavior. What was I doing? Totally skipped over. So we're on 2B here now. This is what I'm talking about. We'll go back to 2A. 2B is talking about in terms of our behavior. Again, if we create the particular pattern of killing or of not killing, then we will create the behavior that is similar to that in the future. That's one of the most, kind of heinous results of our karma, is that whatever we do, we become more inclined to do. Going back to 2A, I'm sorry, I just got wires crossed in my head. In terms of experience, the results that are similar to the cause are pretty much what we're talking about in this text. In terms of experience, these are where we say, okay, in line A, this is what's happening to you. Line B is it's my karma. Line C that's coming up is going to be where we say, and I did this particular action that is causing me to have this experience. The experience is often similar to the cause. For example, if others don't believe you, it's probably because you've lied in the past, so your speech has lost that power to be heard and believed. So your experience of not being trusted with the words that you say is because you have not used your words wisely in the past. You've misled others with your words. And again, we'll see this being the primary one that we're talking about here in terms of the results of our karma are the experiences that we have. So then number 3, which is the fourth on the list here, is environmental results. Environmental results are that these will be also some of the results that we're going to look at in this section, is when things ripen into our very environment, the environment we live in, then they are products also of our own past actions. So everything we experience in terms of our actual day-to-day things that happen to us, the behavior, the tendencies we have, the habits we have, the actual rebirth we're in, as well as the environment that surrounds us, all of these are products of our past actions. Okay, let's take a little break here. It's because I have just about 7 o'clock. When we come back, we'll finish off this little preview of what's going on in these coming verses, and then we'll get into them, and you'll see how they play out in this repetitive pattern with regard to those 4 topics being set out in each of these verses. All right, good. So everyone take 10 minutes, so let's say 7:12 then. Hi, Stella. Okay, good. All right, let's dive back into the text. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, but if you do have questions before we reach the end and you want to make sure they're not forgotten, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and I will go to those when we get to the point of doing questions. So let me go back to the slides. Again, we're going through the format for these next, 36 verses or something from verse 10 through verse 45. The third line of each of them is going to be this specific cause. This answers the question, why me? Well, because you did something in the past that caused that to ripen into this current experience. It makes us aware, of course, of our past actions, and how we must have engaged in these things because they are ripening into that particular result. Again, that being the result similar to the cause in terms of our experience, having something that is kind of very similar. At least we see this for almost all of them, something we did in the past that has ripened into our receiving that in the present. And so this is like seeing the cause of the poison to know more clearly how to transmute it. Of course, because we want to be sure to address how we created it by stopping to create it that way, and in fact doing the opposite of how we created it, so that we can move in the opposite direction towards enlightenment, as opposed to continuing to get caught up in these ridiculous patterns within samsara. Then in line D is going to be the specific remedy, a resolution to act in the opposite way in the future. To say, okay, if I had this through doing this particular action, from now on, I'm going to do something that is totally opposed to that. And of course, also implicit within this, so we're going to see it stated at the beginning, but as Geshe Jumpa Gyatso says in his commentary, we should be practicing taking and giving with each one of these ripening experiences, experiences of suffering. When we have that suffering in our life, we should be gladly taking that on, taking on anyone who is experiencing the same, giving away our happiness so that others know peace, well-being, and so that, again, we don't harm them if they are the subjects who are giving us harm in the first place. So this is like the actual means to transmute the poison, to actually change what we are doing, to have this annihilation of our self-cherishing mind and an embracing of cherishing others. So again, this is the format that we're going to see all of these taking. One thing I'm just going to mention very briefly before we leave the topic of karma is to know that these four opponent powers are the way to purify our negative actions as well. One thing we can also take away from each of these verses is that we have these experiences, therefore we've created the causes for them. And no doubt that's not the only time we created the causes for that. So we should also try to purify whatever it is that we're experiencing, or the karma that created whatever it is that we're experiencing. Again, the karma that's ripening into that actual experience is getting exhausted, but no doubt we've created similar karma. So the four opponent powers are to first regret those actions, even if we can't remember doing them, even if they were a zillion lifetimes ago. We want to generate that mind that says, I firmly regret, I have great remorse for having committed these actions that harm others and that have harmed others and that will harm myself, through their ripening into my future suffering. And then the reliance, developing the minds of refuge and bodhicitta, which is reestablishing a firm foundation for our ability to purify and go forward. Refuge by restoring our relationship with the three jewels, and then bodhicitta by restoring our wish to benefit other beings, to not harm them. Then the third is an actual remedy, which again, there are many different remedies, recitations of mantras like the Vajrasattva mantra, prostrations to the 35 Buddhas, reciting the Heart Sutra, reciting any sutra, meditations can be a remedy. Any virtuous action essentially can be a remedy, as long as you do it in the context of it being the opponent power to contradict the actions that you've regretted in the first step. And then the resolve is important. At the end, you make the determination to refrain from those actions in the future. And as was said in that previous slide, even to move in the opposite way in the future, to say, from now on, I'm not just going to stop killing others, but I'm going to do everything I can to protect them. That would be a way of kind of taking it into an even more positive direction. So resolve can have a slightly different flavor in the context of the bodhisattva path. It's definitely to not do the action again, but if we can make a resolution to go to the complete turnaround, to actually do all of our actions with the wish to benefit others, to cherish them, not just not harm them, but actually do things that will benefit them in the moment. One little thing I'll share, the very first time I had teachings on this, I'm glad I wrote his name down because I would never have remembered who this was. It was in 1997, I think in the summer of 97 in San Francisco at Ling, the FPMT center there. A teacher came through, a touring teacher, Lama, whose name was Venerable Ling Gungkar Tolku. And I went back to his teachings on the first time I taught this, and I found this one there that I even remembered. I just wanted to get kind of his words that I wrote down, at least. This isn't a direct quote, but it's from my notes, where he said, before going into this whole section about this karmic ripening stuff, never take these trainings as seeing them in others. You know, it's really easy when we get the teaching sometimes to go, oh, I know somebody like that. I know somebody who's got that karma ripening for them. Try only to see them in yourself. And I'm not saying it isn't useful to see them in others so that we maybe generate compassion for them, but we often have a tendency to kind of not look in the mirror. You know, we always want to look at other people and say, oh, look at all the faults that they have and all the stuff they're experiencing that are products of their own crazy minds. But we don't look in the mirror and go, oh, that's a product of my own crazy mind. So that's the advice that I thought was nice to start with before we get into these, as well as a little bit from Geshe Sopa. Again, this wasn't in the context of this introduction to this, but nonetheless, I think it's very applicable to what we're going to be going through now. Each of these verses relate to our ordinary daily experiences, explaining them in a religiously elevating way as a training for us. That's in line with what that Lama said in the previous slide, right? Everything is a training for us. It's not, you know, to help us to see these faults in others. People have different capacities. Some may derive great benefit from these practices now, but others may only be able to form the good intention to practice this way in the future. And that's perfectly fine. We all have to start where we are. Some of you may be able to adopt some of what's taught in this section and begin to think of things in this way and meditate in this way. Others may say, you know, I'm not quite there yet, you know, but I have a good intention. I want to move in that direction. That's how we actually eventually move in that direction, is through those thoughts. You know, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but in Buddhism, good intentions actually can lead to eventual changes in behavior and thoughts and what have you. So we actually do want to invest in our good intentions. In the latter case, you should at least say the words in the form of a prayer. You know, so when we say these verses, or when you're saying them yourself in your meditation, make the prayer that you can practice that way. Then, in difficult situations, instead of becoming angry, frustrated, or anxious, which is a huge waste of time, right? He says, you can accept the suffering and channel it to good effect. I mean, eventually, will be what happens when we make these prayers. You know, prayers in Buddhism are about shaping our minds so that we meet things with those thoughts. And so we're making this into a prayer even. Some of you may be able to practice this way, but some of you may need to simply treat these as prayers. You know, may I practice this way in the future. All right, on to verse 10. Verse 10 says, whenever an intolerable ailment arises in our body, okay, so that's the line A. This is the experience that is ripening that we are having to deal with. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. So that's reminding us, that's going to be the same line that's in all of these. Guess what, folks? It's your karma, dude. You know, you need to deal with it. This is your stuff. Why? This is verse line C, for having inflicted harm on the bodies of migrating beings. Like, this is the karma that is created that produces a result similar to the cause in terms of the experience. So the result we have is ailments in our own bodies, physical torment in our own bodies. Well, why do we have that? Because we've inflicted harm on the bodies of migrating beings. We've done things to their bodies, harmed them. You know, I shudder to think about some of the things that I did when I was young, growing up in St. Louis with all the bugs in the summer and all the little lightning bugs in particular that I would pinch off their tails when they were lit. You know, weird, really weird stuff that kids do. You know, and I feel horrible for having done these things to these beings. But whenever I'm experiencing some harm to my own body, that should be reminding me that I've inflicted harm on others. That's ripened into my own, you know, bad health, ailments, illness, what have you. So let's go to Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary, and then we'll come back and look at what Geshe Sopa says. He divides it into these first three lines and then goes on to give the advice of what we should do differently. So he says, whenever an ailment, pain, and so forth arises in our body, we should reflect upon it, thinking, this is the sharp weapons turning against me of the bad actions of inflicting much harm on the bodies of migrating beings, such as beating them, hitting them, putting them in prison, and so forth. I used to imprison insects too, putting them into little jars with holes in the top that were probably barely enough for them to breathe, much less, live in the jar for very long, and so forth, in my previous rebirths and in this life, whatever I've done throughout these lives, this is what is ripening into my own experiencing pain, difficulty in my body. Here, bad actions are said to be sharp weapons because bad actions are similar to sharp weapons in that they cut our happiness, pleasure, and so forth. Therefore, it is stated in this way. Again, he's not going to repeat that again because that line, that second line, is going to be the same refrain in every one of these verses. So again, recall that analogy of the wheel weapon that Vishnu sends out, and it goes out to kind of cut your enemies, but it ends up coming back, and Vishnu catches it on his finger. But for us, it comes back and it harms our own happiness. It induces suffering experiences. So then let's go on to well, let's go back to the slides, right? Because I do have a little bit more to share on that first part. This is where he will go into Tonglen, so it does has a little bit more that we need to go through on that part of the text. So Geshe Sopa says, when you experience physical misfortune, you usually feel anger and frustration, thinking, "I'm a wonderful person. Why is this happening to me?" Right? I mean, who doesn't have that thought? We even have that book, right? When bad things happen to good people. We all think we're good people. I mean, ask anybody. I mean, even the most corrupt politician, I won't give any names, still thinks they're a good person. And they would still say, why is this happening to me? Which only adds mental suffering to your physical pain. Remember this, the twin arrows or the two arrows. The first arrow is the physical pain we experience, but then the second arrow is all the mental anguish we put on top of it. Like, why is this happening to me? And I get angry and upset at the people who did it to me, and I blame them, and kind of go off and off and off, about all of these other things that we want to put the onus on when the onus should be actually put on ourselves. That's what he's going to say here. Instead, you should understand that you are experiencing this because the wheel weapon of bad actions that you turned on others is returning and working on you. As I said, it's your karma, dude. You should recognize that you acted under the influence of the view of a real personal identity. That's the deeper demon of self-grasping, and with a self-cherishing attitude. Again, that coarser level of mind that is all about me first and me wanting my needs met. And that, again, is what induces us to create so much negative karma. Once you have that recognition, you can then work to change yourself by eliminating them, all these mental attitudes, especially the twin demons, and replacing them with an attitude that cherishes others instead of yourself. When you think in this way, even an illness can be turned into something of value. So it's good to remember that, when we have colds or flus, or if, we have the misfortune of getting coronavirus or something even more serious, then we think in that way that this illness can actually be very valuable to us. It's the ripening of our past karma, but moreover, it's teaching us, giving us the lesson of how we need to cherish others. We need to stop doing our habitual stuff, reacting in the ways that we normally do, getting angry and upset. If it wasn't for that person at the store who wasn't wearing a mask, I'd be fine, or whatever the case might be, that people always putting the blame on other people. And he goes on to say, it can benefit the person who is ill to see the illness as a means of purifying previous bad actions, whose results are now coming to fruition, as well as promoting understanding of the destructive nature of unwholesome actions and their effects, and of course, inducing you then to do the opposite. Because if we really understand how destructive all of our actions are, because we see it in our face, it's that wheel coming back around and cutting us now, then we should get the message, learn the lesson from that karma ripening, and do the opposite. Do what will actually produce the causes for happiness, and moreover, will cause others not to be harmed. It will cherish their bodies, their well-being. This kind of thinking can be applied to any bad situation, thus turning it into something positive. And that's what we're going to see. Again, we won't have these sorts of slides for all of these because we're mostly going to just work with the verses, maybe occasionally throwing in a comment or two. But it's good to have this initial verse of this section with this kind of reminder of how we are supposed to think during this. We can apply this anytime when we have something difficult. Reasoning in this way, you will want all the sickness and suffering of the world to come to fruition on yourself and not upon others. That's the complete polar opposite that we want to get to, is where we cherish others so much that we would gladly take their suffering upon ourselves. We're now experiencing suffering, but we're not alone in our suffering. Whatever was in line A of each of these verses, other people experience this too. So we should have that mind that extends out the compassionate wish for them to not suffer and the willingness to take that on ourselves. And of course, to then give them our happiness. But that leads into the very last line of 10D. So how should we actually remedy this? What is the way we transmute that poison of ailments within our own body? Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all ailments without exception. This will be the complete antidote to it, is if we actually think, oh, while I am sick, I'm going to take on the sicknesses of everyone. While I'm dealing with coronavirus, if that should happen, then I'm going to take on everyone's illness. Have that very courageous mind that would gladly take their illness away. As was said by that Lama that Pema Chodron quoted earlier, nothing would make me happier than to be able to take away all of their suffering. Of course, we should also stop harming others. I mean, that goes without saying, stop physically, harming them. This first verse, number 10 of this section, is about physical, pain, physical harm that we're experiencing. And so we should get that message right away. The first thing to do is stop harming others through our actions of body. But then also, of course, do the practice of Tonglen, take on the suffering of others. So here Geshe-la describes again a bit more about Tonglen. He says, for this reason now, without seeking other methods, visualize the Lama deity and so forth on your crown or in the space in front of yourself. So you can visualize whoever it is that you want to work with. You could visualize Yamantaka, this fierce dude, or you could visualize the Buddha, or you could visualize your own guru. But try to see whoever you're visualizing as your own guru, as the essence of all of these holy beings. And make this request from the depths of your heart. Please bless me so that all the bodily ailments of all sentient beings, however many there are, which are more important than my own illness, ripen upon me. So these beings are more important than my own suffering. So they are many. I am only one. I will gladly take all of their ailments on myself. Let them ripen upon me, because my own suffering is less important than all of those beings to be free from suffering. After that, visualize rays of light radiating out from your nostrils. He usually says, in his other commentary, that you actually send it out from your right nostril. Rays of light go out, they strike the sentient beings, whereby you inhale all their, oh, I'm sorry, it comes out from your left, and then well, let me read from his commentary. I want to make sure I do it the way that Geshe-la says that it should be done. Let me pull up the page here that has this on it. Because sometimes I just work with the nostrils, both of them, but he actually does spend some time. He says, visualize all sentient beings in the space in front of you. From their right nostril comes black light or black smoke in the nature of all their sufferings, illnesses, mental afflictions, depression, agitation, and so forth, all their problems. That enters your left nostril and descends to your heart, where it gets rid of your self-cherishing. So that's the first part of it. That's the taking. So again, we can visualize the light going out from our nostrils in general, striking sentient beings, where by you inhale all their sufferings. They come from their right nostril, they enter into your left nostril, and you breathe all of that in. Tonglen is done very effectively working with the breath. Some people say, and even in the earlier Lojong text, it does say to unite it with the breath after some visualization. But I think the visualization and the breath work very well together right from the beginning. So you breathe in that suffering in the form of this thick smoke that comes down to your heart center through your left nostril, and it absorbs into your heart, he says, whereupon your self-cherishing utterly vanishes. So you can visualize your self-cherishing, Geshe-la says, as a heap of black dust, or I think the meditation I'm sending you is like as a hard rock, something that's very dense in the center of your chest that feels kind of heavy to have there. That's your self-cherishing mind that you want to get rid of. So you're going to absorb all that suffering and place it on that mind. Let it annihilate that mind. Let it get rid of that mind through your willingness to take on the suffering of others. Then for the giving, you visualize all your happiness, pleasure, and so forth radiating out through your right nostril, and it enters in the form of white light. It enters to all sentient beings, is given to them, and it enters into their left nostril, and it becomes immediately all of what they need. It's not the same things that we had. It's all of our virtues, qualities, our human body, and so on. All of that is white light, and it goes to that being in front of us, and it immediately becomes exactly what they need as they inhale it, as they bring it into their being. So again, it's kind of a circle here. They're breathing out through their right, in through your left, all of the suffering, out through your right, in through their left, all of the happiness in the form of light. And that's the meditation on completely pure taking and giving. You do that with the desire to take on suffering of others, with the mind that cherishes them, that holds their well-being as more dear than your own. And then you give them all of your happiness with that same accompanying thought that is driven by your love for them, your wish for them to experience happening and happiness and so on. All right, so let's go to the additional comments that I have in my slides. I think I just have a few for this. Oh, I don't have any. Oh, I just let Geshe-la have the last word, which is probably best anyway. So we'll see again at the end of class if there are any questions on Tonglen. I think most of you are quite familiar with it, but know that even though all of these verses don't end with something that shows Tonglen, it is the implicit practice throughout all of these. So verse 11, we continue with another situation here where we have mental suffering, mental anguish, even depression, anxiety, whatever. Whenever suffering arises in our mind, it is definitely the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having disturbed the mental continua of others. So when we've disturbed the minds of others, we've created a cause for our own mind to be disturbed. Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all their dukkha without exception. Dukkha, again, is the Sanskrit word for suffering. We want to take all of their suffering on ourselves without exception as a way of relieving the karma that we created by upsetting the minds of other beings. So again, there's not really, a whole lot of mystery behind all of these. It's just a matter of doing the practice and doing Tonglen as a means to supplement this whole investigation into what we're experiencing, the various karmas that are ripening, and how we need to learn from that. And again, as we get through these first two verses just work with the whole Tonglen idea that we want to take away suffering, take on their dukkha. As we, go through these, we'll see that there are additional bits of advice given. Just like we said with the previous one, we would definitely want to not, harm the minds of others if it's for having disturbed the mental continue of others, as it says at the bottom of that page. That was the third line of this verse. Well, the first thing we should get is, stop upsetting the minds of others. Why cause others to be agitated, to have, frustration, whatever, through whatever we've done. Let's be mindful of others' minds and try to keep them at peace as best as we can, and then do the practice of Tonglen. So here Geshe-la says, this is the top of page 6. Similarly, if ever our mind is under the control of bad conditions, or not even that, when various sufferings arise even senselessly in our mind and we wonder, why is this? Reflect on it, thinking, this is definitely the sharp weapons turning against me of the bad actions committed in previous rebirths of disturbing the mental continua of others, who are illustrated by my lamas, parents, friends, siblings, and so forth. In whatever life we've had, those are often the people that we may have disturbed the most, the people that we have the closest relationships with, unfortunately, but no doubt we've also disturbed the minds of other beings. That's right. It said it's illustrated by that. It's not the entirety of it, but all beings that we've harmed the minds of that karma is ripening now on our minds, being under the control of these negative states. This being so, he says, think, now I will take the dukkha, that is all the suffering of others, upon my own mind. And again, we can think in particular about the mental sufferings. Whereas the previous one, we were taking on all of their ailments, their physical problems. We can think here that we are taking on all of their anguish, their anxiety, what have you. But we bring that down in the form of that black smoke through our left nostril that comes to our self-cherishing at our heart, and it destroys it. It's kind of, we put it there. It's not like, it festers in our system or something. It actually becomes a cause for directly opposing that mind of self-cherishing. And it says, then, as before, make the request to the Lama and do the visualizations of taking and giving. So it was essentially what I just said, to do that meditation. So let's go on. I don't think I have any other additional slides for this one. Let's go on to verse 12. Again, we're going to see that same format. Line A, whenever we are tormented by intense hunger and thirst. If that does ripen for people, I mean, we do have, people who weren't experiencing hunger and thirst a year ago who now, have that as maybe a common experience in their lives. Well, what is that? And why is that there? It's the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. Why? What's more specifically? For having cheated, stolen, appropriated, and acted miserly. This is often what they say is at the cause of having resources such as food, drink, shelter, clothes, whatever. All of these things that we have in our lives are the product of our own past generosity. Well, if we've taken the goods of others, that's an inappropriate way of acquiring them, cheated others for their wealth. We've acted miserly with the things we do have. All of that has created that type of karma that will ripen into you not having the resources that you need for sustaining your life. So the last line, now we should willingly take upon ourselves all hunger and thirst without exception. And again, implicit within that is that we should stop cheating others, stealing from them, taking things that aren't offered, appropriating goods that, in a mischievous ways, acting miserly with the things that we do have. We should be very generous and, give as much as we can to others. So Geshe-la says in regard to this, whenever the intense anguish of hunger and thirst arises, think, this is the result of the bad actions committed in previous rebirths of having cheated others for the sake of their wealth, stolen others' wealth and appropriated it by force, and having been miserly with my own wealth. After that, think, now, however much suffering of hunger and thirst of other sentient beings exists, I will willingly take it all upon my own suffering of hunger and thirst. As before, make the request and meditate on taking and giving. So one of the things that's pointed out here when it says kind of take upon my own suffering of hunger and thirst, this is of course one of the most powerful ways that we can work with any of these negative things that are arising, is when we think about those who are experiencing something very similar. So if you were to get coronavirus, then to be dealing with that illness with the thought of may others who have that illness right now, may all of their suffering ripen upon me. That's one of the most powerful ways of working with that illness. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says how this is actually how you can cure illness with your mind through having that thought of taking upon the illness of others. Everybody thinks it's the opposite, right? If you had cancer and your doctor said, what you should think about is taking all the cancer of everyone else in the world on yourself, you'd be like, no, that's not what I want. I want to give my cancer away to someone else. Be happy if someone else had it. But we want to do the exact opposite. We want to actually have the thought that I would willingly take on all that cancer. I'm already experiencing it. If I'm the person with cancer, right? Well, then why not make it useful? Why not make it into something that actually generates a genuine concern for the well-being of others that goes against the self-cherishing that got us into the situation of having cancer to begin with? So again, this is the most powerful way to work with whatever we're experiencing, is to transmute it. And even if you simply say, well, through my having this and suffering this way, may they not suffer. Like I'll be the sacrificial lamb in a sense. And it doesn't mean you then have to take everybody else's suffering on. You can at least say through my dealing with this problem, hunger, thirst, physical problems, may others not have to do that. That's already a very powerful thought. But if you can get to a place where you actually take their suffering on and think that it's going away from them, that they're not experiencing it any longer, that's a very, very powerful way to work with this. Again, I don't have any commentary for a number of these. This one I will have some commentary for, I think, from a couple of sources. Whenever we are powerlessly exploited and tormented by others, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. Again, there's that refrain. Why? For having hated those who are inferior and treated them as slaves. So this is the first verse where we get into kind of an action that is in opposition to that in the fourth line. The fourth line, again, is the particular remedy that's mentioned here. Now we should use our body and life in the service of others. So again, we might not think, well, I've never been, powerlessly exploited and tormented by others, but we have shades of this in our life, right? Anybody who has a boss probably feels exploited at times, maybe even tormented by them, but even in relationships, sometimes we have that dynamic going on between two people, in terms of one person having greater power over the other. We might even have it in familial relationships with siblings or with parents or children or whatever. So it's not to say again that this has to be, that they're treating us like we're their slaves, but there's some flavor of that going on. Well, it's because we've put others down who were inferior and treated them in a similar way. We've denigrated them, we've taken advantage of them, and so on. So we should do the exact opposite. We should actually be in service of others. So let's see what Geshe Jumpa Gyatso says on this in his commentary, because this is a very powerful statement, right? To be of service to others, to think that that's how we live our lives is always being of service to others. In fact, whoops, sorry, it's going to go down just a little bit more, and then it ended up jumping. Okay, so in the original FPMT handbook that was used to be a hard copy that was distributed to all of the centers and what have you, for the directors and SPCs to read and teachers, what have you, the very first part of it was Rinpoche talking about how the centers exist to serve others. I mean, this is a real spirit of the Mahayana, right? Is that we think we are there to serve others. So let's look at what Geshe Jumpa Gyatso says. To be powerlessly exploited by others is, for example, to have to engage without rest, without choice, and without the wish to do so in actions and so forth, upon even the slightest order of a master and the like, someone who is a superior to you, due to which one's body and mind become tormented by suffering, because we have to fulfill their needs because of that power dynamic. Whenever that happens, we should think that it is definitely the sharp weapons turning against us, that is, ripening upon us, of the bad actions of having violently hated inferior sentient beings in the past, held ourselves to be superior. That's why it's ripening into the experience of others, holding themselves as superior to us and tormenting us. And it says, for example, it is the result of bad actions such as that the people from central Tibet presently look out of strong hatred with glaring eyes and so forth at their countrymen from Tsang and continuously exploit them powerlessly for work and so forth. So apparently this was something that did go on in Tibet, but we can see it still as a dynamic in America in many ways, the ways that many parts of our population are taken advantage of and utilized for meager wages and what have you. Wage theft is a huge topic in a lot of circles around social justice, because there's a lot of injustice that does go on in this dynamic of people who are the bosses, the masters, taking advantage of others. Once again, though, we're not trying to point it out in others as that advice was given. We want to see this in ourselves. To what degree are we taken advantage of by others? And do we have that resentment towards them that would be our normal reaction? Instead, as it says here, now, from this point of view, we should meditate thinking, from now on, I will not make use of my body and life for my own welfare, but will use them in the service of others. It doesn't mean that, I have to go around from door to door and see what errands people need and, what things they need fixed and, take care of everybody's, possessions and what have you, and, correct everything, fix everything. It means instead that I want to live my life with that spirit. The spirit of bodhicitta is one of being of service to others, right? Where we want to keep developing our perfections, generosity, and so on, so that we'd be willing to give away even our own bodies if we were asked to do so. Can't do it now, but we want to develop that attitude of service. So as I said, I do have a few additional slides to share for this one. Geshe Sopa says now, when the weapon of those past actions turns back on yourself, instead of being angry at the people who oppressed you, you should remember that they are also creating consequences that will return upon themselves and that they will suffer the same fate as you. He's pointing out a logic that when we do have these examples where someone else is causing harm to us, this is a way of also doing thought transformation, is to think that that person who's doing that harm to you is creating negative karma that they will then have to suffer the consequences of in the future. They will experience something similar to what you're experiencing. This is the circular effect of karma. You know, I do that to that person, it causes them to do that to me, and then because I react habitually, I do that again to them, which causes them to do that to me, and it's a back and forth. And so we should have compassion for people who are stuck in that karmic circle. He goes on to say, you should feel compassion toward such persons and wish to take upon yourself all the negative results that they are creating. So it's another dimension that we can include in our Tonglen, is it's not just taking upon them others who are suffering in that same way, it's taking upon ourselves the karma and the karmic effects of the beings who are doing that to us. Say, I will gladly experience their negative results so that they can be free of those. That's a pretty, tall wish, a tall order, for us to be that willing to even take on the suffering of that person. We tend to think, well, that's their karma. They're going to have to deal with it themselves. Well, no, I'll take on not just, suffering that's similar to mine. I will take on the future suffering of that being that's going to be similar to mine, who's actually the one harming me. Big, big wish here. Then from Good Karma, Venerable Thupten Chodron's commentary, she says, our present powerlessness and servitude is the result of having selfishly used and disrespected others, denying them opportunities and rights. To repair this, we make a strong determination to employ our body and life in the service of others. Again, that was what was in the root text. So she's just pointing out that, again, it's the self-cherishing, the selfish use of others, thinking of ourselves first, that we're going to take advantage of others. That's why we're being taken advantage of. Regardless of whether somebody has high or low social status, we should respect and benefit them. Especially as people who aspire for full awakening, we cultivate the mind that cherishes others more than the self, and we should try to live that attitude by serving others in whatever way is possible. Then she has this wonderful quote. This is why I threw this in here from Lama Yeshe. She says, I clearly remember Lama Yeshe addressing us monastics, holding his prayer beads, his mala at his heart. He said, this should be your mantra. As he turned each bead, he said, I am the servant of others. I am the servant of others. And continued through the whole mala probably. And it's not just monastics, all of us should have this, whether we are lay or ordained. We should think that this is our role in life, is to serve others as best as we can. Admittedly, as I said, we can't do everything for everybody. We can't live our lives completely absorbed in all of that, because we have to develop our minds too. But it's in our actions that those mental thoughts actually are manifested. So when we do have someone asking us for help, asking us for something that they need, we should be saying, oh, this is my opportunity to serve others. This is my opportunity to be a benefit to them. And I'm always still surprised at how much that little resistance comes up, when somebody says, oh, can you, I have this going on, can you help me with it? And you're like, a little bit of that stuff. And then you have to go, oh yeah, that's right. This is my opportunity. We can all still see it. And some of us see it maybe greater than others, some lesser than others. That's great. But, we all have to deal with that struggle to be of service to other beings. Again, it doesn't mean that we do whatever they need to, bring them, kind of this tainted happiness. Ideally, all what we do should be about their ultimate happiness. Temporal happiness is important to some degree, but it's not the be all and end all of everything. And some people even have, again, distorted views of what they mean by temporal happiness. So if somebody says, yeah, I want you to help me to rob this store, and what I want you to do is go in there, you don't say, oh, I want to be of service to others, I'm going to help you rob this store. You acknowledge that that's not good for them. It's going to only create more suffering for them. And therefore, the temporal happiness that they'd gain by stealing money from a store that you'd help them with is not going to be happiness at all. It's actually going to be, again, distorted happiness. It's only going to lead to future pain. So we don't want to, take this to extremes and say, I just serve others and do whatever they want me to do, regardless of whether it's moral or immoral. We have to have some measure of all of that. Let me just go through a couple more verses if I can, at least one or two, and then we will have some questions. So verse 14 is at the bottom of page 6. Whenever unpleasant words arise to our ears, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for faults of speech, such as, it should say, such as divisive talk and the like. Now we should reproach our errors of speech. So we have to correct our speech if we are experiencing unpleasant speech towards us. Again, makes sense, right? Most of you who've studied karma before know that this is referring to the non-virtues of speech that are part of the 10 non-virtues. So Geshe-la in his commentary at the top of page 7 says, whenever others say unpleasant words to us by way of false accusations, for instance, to the point that we are disparaged, caught in a disagreement, senselessly reprimanded even by our boss and so forth, at that time, without thinking, what can I do? Think, this is the result of my errors of speech in the past, of having used divisive speech on others, that is, having caused them to disagree with each other, having spoken harsh words to them, having disparaged them, and so forth. Then, from now on, through reproaching our errors of speech, such as divisive talk, harsh words, and so forth, we should no longer engage in them. Now, again, the bodhisattva will probably also want to not just avoid those words, but what divisive talk means, not dividing, where it means to divide others with our speech. So not doing divisive talk would be simply to avoid that type of speech, but we would actually want to even go further and do what we would call beneficial speech, harmonious speech, speech that brings people together. So just keep that in mind, that there, is that other aspect of the bodhisattva path that maybe isn't always communicated in these verses, but again, it would be implicit in there. For verse 14, the only thing I shared in a slide is the 4 non-virtues of speech. 2 of them were already mentioned in our commentary, right? Divisive speech, where we divide others by saying things that are true or untrue. And it can be people who are already divided. We just keep doing more to divide them. A lot of what's going on in our country right now is divisive speech, right? It's an us and them mentality, saying things negative about the other side. So you generate more hatred, vilify the other side from your side, and also anger and upset the people on the other side. So the division becomes even greater. But it can happen at a very small level of just like, 2 people that you divide through your speech, even if they have not been divided, or if they have had some division. Anything you say that contributes to that is in that category. Harsh speech is anything that people don't like to hear, that's, harsh to the ears, language or volume or whatever, however you are using that speech to say negative things, to cut at others with your speech. Lying and meaningless speech, perhaps we don't harm others quite as much with that, to where we experience something unpleasant, but obviously lying, as we saw, I mentioned it earlier, if people aren't believing your speech, it's because you've used your speech deceptively. So whenever people are lying to you or not believing what you say, that's a form of unpleasant speech that you're having to hear. It's due to your own lying. So stop the lying and be very honest. Be meticulous in being honest with what you say, so that you never say anything that is even slightly deceptive. Meaningless speech is when we use our speech to just rabbit on about this and that with no real purpose. So I'm quoting Venerable Rabina there. She likes to use that word rabbit on, phrase rabbit on. Okay, let's start with verse 15 next time, because I've got 5-2 and I don't want to see if there are any questions, and then do our wrap up. But I feel like I've also talked an awful lot tonight. Sorry if I'm using too many words, but any questions on what we talked about? Keep in mind, this is what you're going to be seeing for the next couple of classes, so if everyone's got a handle on this whole format, I think that's good. Just know that you're going to keep seeing different experiences that could come into your life, and kind of, okay, this is happening. Recognize first, it's my karma, I created it. then recognize more specifically, well, how did I create that? What was the more specific cause of that? And then think again, I need to do the opposite, or even go beyond just opposite to the extreme opposite, where I do something that's the antithesis of that. So rather than, dividing others with my speech, I actually try to bring others together through my speech, use my speech in skillful ways. Say you have siblings who aren't talking, then you do what you can to try to bring them together by talking to each of them or both of them together, to use your own speech to try to bring them together. Any comments, questions, criticisms?
I have a quick thing. John, can you put my video back on? Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Okay.
All right.